Chapter 3: The New Root, Race, and a New World Order. The first century of the new millennium will see a whole new way of living on Earth, a change even more drastic than the one 500 years ago, when the Middle Ages ended and the Renaissance began. A new consciousness in humanity will arise in the 21st century, something that is so completely different that Case called it a new root race. It will profoundly affect political, social, economic, and scientific aspects of our society. The expression root race is found in several metaphysical systems of thought, and it is not a reference to racial differences, as we typically think of them. Instead, it refers to a new order of human being. The Case Millennium Prophecies challenge us to imagine that we are on the verge of a dramatic new beginning, a new root race, one critical aspect of the consciousness of this new life. In the new millennium, we can expect a revolutionary change, the universal acceptance of the fact that we survive physical death. The continuity of life will be accepted, not just as a statement of religious faith, but as a mainstream scientific reality. Of course, the early signs of this widespread understanding are all around us, led by research into out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. These findings are dramatic, some would say nearly incontrovertible for anyone who looks objectively at the research data. Truly, we live in times when a remarkable convergence is taking place on this age-old question of survival. Religion and science are coming to the same conclusion. Nevertheless, strong cultural forces work against this new agreement. Certain elements of our society would just as soon we dismiss or forget such an important fact as our own timeless existence as spiritual beings. Much of our impatient, consumer-driven culture depends on the emotions of fear and desire, the very feelings that so easily melt away when we accept the continuity of life. And so there is still considerable work to be done if the consciousness of a new root race is really to take hold and guide the world. How might this Case prediction about overcoming the fear of death actually unfold? The development of a certain form of psychic perception may play a great role in such a change of consciousness. We'll look more broadly at the topic of psychic awareness later in this chapter. If large numbers of the human family evolve clairvoyant abilities, imagine what might be the result. Perhaps people would begin to see and communicate with those who have passed on, using the same type of expanded sight that allows someone to see auras. People in the new millennium might perceive the spiritual world bodies of friends and loved ones. Such a development would have tremendous impact on the values and awareness of humanity. So much of human behavior has long been motivated by a fear of death, by uncertainty about our long-term future as individual beings. Competition and aggression stem largely from the drive to survive and strengthen our sense of power and permanence. If it was a common experience to know that death is merely a transition to a new way of living, we can guess that efforts for peace and cooperation in the world would be enhanced. This speculation dovetails nicely with a biblical prophecy about times of change. Certain verses from the Bible seem to predict that the reappearance of the Christ is to be associated with a period in which the dead will be resurrected. But how probable is it, we might wonder, that corpses will crawl out of the graves? Another interpretation is that experientially it will be as if the dead have been resurrected. In other words, to those of us still alive in flesh bodies, it will be as if the dead have come back to life, because we will sense them and communicate with them in their astral or etheric forms. Perhaps the biblical prophecy means that the reappearance of Christ will come at a time in history when humanity has developed its spiritual sensitivity to the point where other dimensions of life can be readily sensed and experienced. Humanity has flirted with this breakthrough principle in the past, according to Case. The new root race will possess an awareness similar in many ways to one that was present on the earth long ago. In ancient times, he said, there were societies based on an understanding of the inherent oneness of all energy and the continuity of soul life. The opportunities for humanity in the 21st century and beyond are not merely a return to something we had many millennia ago. But one task of the new root race is to go back and reclaim certain elements of the human legacy that have been ignored or forgotten. The trigger for this collective recall is to be an astounding archaeological discovery. According to the case Millennium Prophecies, this event is a strong possibility for the years right at the turn of the 21st century. In several places on the globe, records can be found of an extraordinary human civilization which predates by many thousands of years the earliest known advanced civilization. That culture had developed many sophisticated scientific ideas, including the harnessing of solar energy via specialized crystals, plus advanced energy medicine techniques. What's more, that civilization possessed a knowledge base that connected their religious understandings with their scientific principles, just as we are on the verge of doing at the start of our own millennium. If the traces of such a civilization, victim of its own mistakes, internal discord about purpose and ultimate self-destruction, could be found now, it might be one of the most important breakthroughs in recent history. The case Millennium Prophecies suggests it could be just around the corner. Those records are to be found in any of the 3 spots. One beneath the sands, in front of the Sphinx, a small pyramid-like hall of records is buried there, according to Case, and just waiting to be unearthed. Among the 3 possibilities, this is the location about which Case was most specific. He saw an underground passageway coming from the paw of the Sphinx that would lead archaeologists to their tremendous find. In recent years, research teams have been actively investigating Case's hypothesis. They have used non-invasive technologies such as underground mapping radar to discover intriguing anomalies, e.g. unexpected spaces or cavern-like areas, for which the Egyptian government may eventually permit limited drilling or excavation. 2. Somewhere on the Yucatan Peninsula. Here, Case was not as specific, but he suggests that remnants of that same ancient civilization left records nearly identical to the ones buried in the other 2 spots. The best clue about exact location indicates that the archaeological find could come from investigating an area near or beneath an existent ancient temple, where the temple there is overshadowing somewhere near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. The Case Prophecies offer some tantalizing clues about exact underwater spots to investigate, and limited investigations for the legendary Atlantis have been going on for several years to test Case's theory. What might be the impact if one or more of these areas yield evidence of an advanced civilization that was based on sophisticated understanding of the oneness of all energy and the direct experience by its people of the soul's survival? Skeptics might argue that it would have little or no influence on a modern world whose attention span for news gets shorter every year, whose inhabitants aren't even interested in history. But a counter-argument can be made that if such an archaeological find coincides with times of turmoil and stress, perhaps even daunting earth-change events, it could well trigger a whole new way for modern society to see itself. Consider what might happen if we stretch our sense of roots back thousands of years earlier and realize that some of the fruits of civilization we're most proud of were actually accomplished long ago. It might humble us. It might awaken us to the possibility that our own culture is fragile, and that in our vulnerability we could suffer a similar fate and practically vanish. With these background ideas in mind about a new root race, a new kind of humanity for this planet, let's consider some further prophecies and visions of Case. Each prophecy is a piece of grand mosaic. That big picture is ultimately a hopeful and exciting one about the new kind of awareness that is about to emerge. The prophecies of change documented in the remainder of this chapter will cover 4 areas. 1. International politics and the destiny of nations. 2. A transformation of medical science. 3. Expanded human mental capacities, especially via intuition. 4. A new philosophy of material resources and the law of supply. Through these prophecies, Case tried to help us catch a picture of what it might be like to live in the world that stretches into the new millennium, what it might be like as members of this new root race. The World Affairs Prophecies. Case made many surprising, bold statements about the nations of the earth and their destinies. The so-called World Affairs readings most often focused on questions of Case's own day, the depression and the tensions that eventually led to World War II. However, occasional prophecies looked beyond the war and predicted the course nations would take well into the 21st century. The essential ingredient in these predictions is the need Case saw for a leveling in the world. In calling for equality, he was not associating himself with any particular political system, rather his political philosophy, as well as his vision of the direction in which the world must heed, focused on the oneness of humanity. That leveling, as the readings called it, is a process that pertains to judgment as well as resources. All persons must be seen as equals in the way they are measured or judged, and all persons must have an equal opportunity to share in the resources that sustain life. This means not only food, shelter, clothing, and energy, but also knowledge, appreciation, and love, which sustain the mind and soul. A single reading, given just 14 months before the outbreak of World War II in Europe, best outlines Case's visionary ideas about a world in flux. A new order of conditions is eventually to emerge. It will be accompanied by a cleansing at all strata of the society, from the richest to the poorest. Central to the transition will be the principle that each soul is its brothers and sisters' keeper in many elements of society, political, economic, and social. The understanding will emerge that a leveling is required. But Case's prophecy goes on to say that these changes won't happen instantaneously or magically. Individuals, groups, and organizations that espouse this ideal of oneness and equality will need to work hard to practice and apply what they believe in. The transitions may not be easy, but it will require a new way of thinking and behaving in society. There cannot be one measuring stick for the laborer in the field and the man behind the counter, and another for the man behind the money changers. All are equal, not only under the material law, but under the spiritual. The prophecy continues with a warning of great stresses ahead. Family members will find themselves on opposing sides in this struggle. Groups will clash, as will races, but this transition is a part of human destiny. The leveling must come. Our only real protection comes from a single source. According to the way this prophecy ends, by personally setting a high spiritual ideal and then diligently living it in relationship to the people around us. In one passage, the readings made clear that this task of leveling was not a call for communism, even in the pure sense of the word. Thus stated, not that all would be had in common as in the communistic idea, save as to keep that balance, to keep that oneness. On the other hand, the Case Millennium prophecies spoke even more strongly against the notion of survival of the fittest, or of the greatest and most powerful, which has characterized pure capitalism. It will not do for us to sit back and say that those people who are exploited are simply not motivated enough, nor will it do to slip into a distorted notion of reincarnation and soul-level responsibility, claiming that the disadvantaged of the world are merely meeting their own karma. Case's visionary image of international affairs was that peace can come only when the ideal of I am my brother's and sister's keeper has been adopted. How will that come about? What changes will we have to see in specific nations? If that purpose and ideal is ever to be achieved, the analysis given by Case was that the problem lies in a particular tendency of all nations to set some standard of some activity of man as its idea. In other words, nations have different concepts about 1. How human life should be evaluated, 2. What constitutes the good life, 3. What constitutes justice, and 4. What scope of authority a government should have over individuals. And the efforts of nations to impose their own standards on other nations create international tensions and wars for each major nation. Case saw work or a change to be done. In the case of Russia, Case foresaw a tremendous transition. He warned that there would never be peace in that country until there was freedom of speech. He predicted a reawakened religious spirit in Russia, which if developed would be the hope of the world. He also clearly predicted a major role in the world leadership for Russia. When asked to comment in 1938 about the prospects for Russia, he predicted that a new understanding would come to a troubled people. Oppression and self-indulgence had produced the excess of communism, and until there was authentic freedom of speech and worship, turmoil would persist. The theme of religious freedom had actually been part of a Case prophecy 6 years earlier in reading. In his vision of the world of a new millennium, Case saw Russia's religious development as pivotal. He said, on Russia's religious development will come the greater hope of the world. These words indicate that spiritual transformations among Russians will trigger changes in people and nations worldwide. What's more, we can expect that religious progress in Russia will so ease international tension that it will make room for hopeful new conditions to arise. Years later, in 1944, yet another Case prophecy used the theme of hope in relation to the Russians. The key to Russia fulfilling its potential will be freedom and the ideal of service, that each man will live for his fellow man. What sort of timing can we expect for such a planetary leadership, and in what form? In Case, Millennium Prophecies made clear that such a potential can be fulfilled only by Russia joining in cooperative efforts with the United States. As to timing, he stated that the principle has been born. What could he have meant by this? In 1944, when this reading was given, a group of souls had recently incarnated into Russia with a purpose to turn that nation around, to make it a champion for peace and permit, a religious rebirth within its borders. It took years for this possibility to crystallize. Those souls born in 1940 or thereabouts were unable to assume positions to exert much influence on the decision-making process of the government until they were at least 50 years old. Throughout the Cold War era, that nation was characterized by aged leadership. The timing seems about right that in 1989, extraordinary changes began to take place in Russia. Certainly the Gorbachev-led changes were just the beginning, a start toward what Case predicted, but the transformation is about more than just one man's political efforts. The group of souls that Case envisioned still has considerable work left to do. They must remember the purpose for which they came and not get caught up in the ways of the old system. What about prophecies concerning the United States? In the case of America, Case had some strong words of warning, but words of promise as well. Again, the principle of leveling came up. There is a warning that unless creative, loving steps are taken to ensure greater equality within this nation, there will come a revolution, a physical armed struggle, because this is the means that some people resort to when they feel helpless to effect change in any other way. Case did not give an endorsement of such methods, only a warning that they may be just ahead for us. The prophecies regarding America emphasize freedom and the leadership role that America is to play on the world stage. Leadership both with the responsible expressions of freedom and the deepening of spirituality. Although America is destined to have the opportunity for spiritual leadership, as we move into the new millennium, it is by no means certain that we will collectively claim that special role. The outcome rests with our use of the freedoms we possess. The ideal of freedom is one to be admired, but Case questioned just how honestly America lives that ideal. In a prophecy given in 1944, some 2 decades before the Civil Rights Movement. He observed that our nation was being run in such a fashion that the hearts and minds of many people were bound. This surely refers in large part to minorities, such as the African American citizens of the country. He identified 3 aspects of life where this constriction affected many people: speech, worship, and the basic physical needs of life. It could be persuasively argued that progress has been made in the 50 years since that warning, but no doubt we still have considerable room for improvement. Another prophetic reading identified the great fear of Americans: servitude in any form. We are afraid of losing our freedom, and yet we may have distorted what that very word means. We have made the quality of obedience a sign of weakness, and in so doing have undermined our spirituality. Our actions cannot fulfill the challenge and opportunity of spiritual leadership in the world if we have a self-serving definition of freedom. True freedom comes from the desire and ability to be obedient, not to another nation, but to God. And in our obedience to God, we will be called to loving, responsible service. This means national actions that place a high priority on the well-being of others. Although it seems paradoxical, Case states that the nation that would be greatest and most free must be a servant to all. Case clearly articulated this principle as the guiding definition for national greatness in the 21st century. It's a hard principle for our nation, or for any nation, to understand and to live. Misunderstanding it, we slip into what Case called the great sin of America: pride. This quality could stand between America and its spiritual destiny to provide leadership for the world. Pride, not just on the part of the government, but in the people as individuals, needs to be overcome. Our tendency to boast separates us from other nations and people of this world. It puts up barriers between Americans and the citizens of other countries. Once Case was asked very directly about America's spiritual destiny. He answered that every nation has a specific spiritual destiny, that each one is led by forces from the heavens. America can fulfill her destiny only by adopting greater brotherhood and love of others. Otherwise, the leadership of the world will once again move westward. Each and every nation is led, even as in heaven. If there is not the acceptance in America of the closer brotherhood of man, the love of the neighbor as self, civilization must wend its way westward. From other Case prophecies, we can ascertain that westward movement would be to Eastern Asia. The key to whether or not leadership eventually moves is this question: what will individuals do with the spiritual knowledge they have? It is not so much the choices of government officials or the legislative bills passed by Congress that determine whether or not we will fulfill our national challenge. Instead, it's what each of us does as an individual that will collectively create our future. Perhaps the beneficiary of a movement of civilization westward would be China. This mysterious nation has only in the past few years made efforts to become part of the world community once again. Its resources and people are vast. Its spiritual legacy from several thousand years is matched by no other major nation except India. It is exciting to imagine what good could be done by these people if their national ideal and purpose became unity and spirituality. It was such a vision that Case put forth in the World Affairs Prophecies. China will eventually be the cradle of Christianity, as applied in the lives of men. However, no time frame accompanies this prediction beyond the caution that it is far off as man counts time. Are we then to expect that someday there will be widespread Christianity in the world's most populous nation? A few decades ago that seemed nearly impossible. During the 1960s, what churches there were had to be closed and religious activity was forbidden, but now there are signs of change, and maybe Case's prophecy will yet come true. Recent newspaper accounts tell an amazing story. The World Council of Churches reports that Christianity is growing in China at breathtaking speed. A council delegation returned from an 11-day trip to China in the spring of 1996 and made a conservative estimate of baptized Christians, 10 million, and growing fast. But maybe the proliferation of Christian churches isn't exactly what the Case prophecy meant. The key word in the prediction is Christianity as applied in human lives. Perhaps it is in this country that the way of living with each other that Jesus proposed will find a willing climate, whether or not the Chinese accept. Jesus is secondary to this prophecy. Here is a people, in Case's estimation, who may be especially ripe for the application of Christ's teachings. In doing so, they would surely assume the spiritual leadership of civilization on this planet. But as the prophecy says, this may be many years away. We have our own work to do closer to home right now, toward that same ideal. Finally, it should be noted that amongst all the world affairs predictions of revolution, turmoil, changes of government, and so forth, there is still a message of profound encouragement. It is so easy for us to be discouraged by current events and to dwell upon the great confusion among nations. However, Case may have been able to look at the world from a broader perspective. In that remarkable state from which he gave his prophetic readings, he may have been able to see the unfolding of history in terms of ages, and not just the decades and centuries we see. And from this vantage point, he said that there is hope for our own times, near the turn of the millennium. Case foresaw a tremendous seeking in our world. Remarkable numbers of people would desire oneness with God and an understanding of God's purposes. The seeking would be greater than it had been for ages, and it will continue to increase each year, giving us good reason to be hopeful. Prophecies of health and healing in the 21st century. Case made many hopeful predictions about healing in the new millennium. In fact, there is considerable evidence of his skill at predicting trends in medical science. For example, in 1927, he boldly asserted that the day would come when a person's overall physical condition could be completely diagnosed from a single drop of blood. At that time, it seemed fanciful, but the day is fast approaching when medical technology can do exactly that. His prophetic statements about finding a remedy to cancer are also noteworthy. In the 1920s and 1930s, Case spoke on repeated occasions of a different orientation to the prevention and cure of many, if not all, cancers, one of strengthening the immune system. This ran counter to the prevailing wisdom about cancer in Case's own era. It wasn't until the early 1960s that a failure in the immune system was even seriously considered by mainstream medicine as linked to some cancers. In a few of his psychic readings on cancer, Case spoke of culturing the blood, that is, removing a small portion, mixing it with prescribed solutions, and then reinfusing this cultured blood, apparently to stimulate the white blood cells. This procedure, although never carried out for any of the cancer patients Case diagnosed, closely resembles an experimental method of modern cancer research. In the 21st century, we may well see that Case was far ahead of his time in associating cancer with the immune system. But such novel techniques are simply fascinating details of much bigger picture. Case envisioned for the new millennium a profoundly different kind of human understanding about how the body stays healthy and how it reestablishes health when something goes wrong. Those prophecies are based on the emergence of a fundamental conception of the human being which is holistic. In fact, Case was characterized as the father of holistic medicine by an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association. In the 21st century, he believed we will begin to appreciate fully that the human being is a set of penetrating energy fields, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. The concept of psychosomatic illness, already widely accepted as an explanation for certain ailments, will have greatly expanded. Not only will we appreciate the authenticity of psychosomatic health, but our approach to healing will also appreciate the deep spiritual undertones to many illnesses and maladies. To encapsulate Case's vision of medicine in the new millennium, it will be energy medicine, patterns in the flesh, in our emotional outlook, in our attitude, and in our deepest sense of purpose will all be understood as expressions of energy. Although modern medical science is only begrudgingly beginning to consider the subtle forms of energy that mystics like Case describe, the day may be soon ahead when they will be widely recognized. As noted earlier, Case even predicted that in the centuries just ahead, humanity will understand that religion and science must merge. A starting point is the discovery that electricity is one way for us to understand the creative force that is God. That is to say, electrical forces are the key to the elusive vital force healers and metaphysicians have sought for ages. That is not to say that Case advocates giving up our worship of God as the imparter of high ideals and moral principles. Case's innovative concept of electricity. It's not an invitation to worship electrical batteries or the products of the electronics industry. Instead, it's a recognition that there is one fundamental life force, which is creative and healing in its nature. That divine force expresses itself in the three-dimensional material world as positive and negative charge, i.e., electricity. As one case passage put it, for materiality is, or matter is, that demonstration and manifestation of the units of positive and negative energy, or electricity, or God. The potential consequences of such a breakthrough understanding by humanity is astounding. For example, an energy medicine of the 21st century will begin to show us how new forms of electrical therapy can stimulate healing and even regeneration. Experimentation in the late 20th century is already beginning to show in some animal studies that electrical impulses can promote the regrowth of limbs. The new millennium, electricity will be seen as the fundamental building block of everything we experience in material life, including our bodies. So what might be possible in the decades and centuries to come? One exciting possibility is the sustenance of human life to age 120 or even 150. This is a lifespan that Case suggests is within our reach and would even be normal if we began to practice health care appropriately. He even went so far as to say that a human being really ought to be able to regenerate himself and live as long as he desires, if he is ready to pay the price in terms of the sacrifices and commitments required for a holistically balanced lifestyle. Several basic features make up Case's healthcare approach, and he predicted they will form the foundation of our health and healing practice in the new millennium. In his book Keys to Health, which summarizes the essence of Case's visionary health philosophy, Eric Mine, MD, identifies several key points about what is possible for a health science of the future. Each of these points concerns our own attitudes and approaches to health and wellness. 1. An expanded view of the interconnections of the body. Case tried to show, well before most medical experts were willing to listen, that the system of the body are deeply interlinked. Slowly, evidence is mounting of the wisdom of this idea. For example, the new medical science of psychoneuroimmunology has begun to demonstrate the mind, the nervous system, and the immune system are all connected. Even though this link might make sense to the layman, it was not until recently that scientific research had any evidence that these three human systems directly affect each other. 2. Self-responsibility. We'll certainly still have the physicians in the 21st century, but we will come to see health and healing as processes that require our own participation first. 3. No magic bullet. Modern medical research has provided us with so many impressive medications that it's easy to slip into expecting a magic pill for any ailment. But in spite of the wonderful progress in pharmacology, the fact remains that for many, if not most, human maladies, it's the body itself that creates the healing, not a magic medicine. Dr. Main writes that by some estimates, as many as 75% of the patients who visit their doctors have illnesses that will get better on their own if they are going to get better at all. In the 21st century medicine that Case envisions, there will be formulas, pills, and drugs, but we will have learned more about the marvelous self-healing forces that can be elicited from within ourselves. This potential is beautifully illustrated by the way that most current prescription drugs work within our bodies. They mimic what the body has the potential to do for itself. For example, morphine can eliminate pain because the chemical structure of its molecules attached to specific receptors that exist on cell membranes. But morphine molecules can block pain only because human cellular chemistry already provides receptors for certain molecules to do so. That chemical possibility existed in the human body for thousands and thousands of years before poppies were ever refined to make the drug morphine. And in fact, in the 1970s, medical researchers discovered why. The body has a drug of its own, endorphins, that blocks pain naturally. In the medicine of a new millennium, we will discover many more ways in which drugs are only a temporary stopgap measure until the patient can learn for himself how to elicit his body's own healing forces. The Case Millennium Prophecies include several specific breakthroughs in medical understandings that might be just ahead for us. Each one is related to the innovative, holistic philosophy he he pioneered. Among them, these promising areas for discovery. 1. The majority of people in the mental hospitals will show measurable improvement from properly administered osteopathic adjustments to the spinal vertebrae. 2. The mysterious skin disorder, psoriasis, will be completely curable using a specialized diet, specific herbal teas, and osteopathic adjustment. 3. Many cases of asthma will be treated as a disorder of the nerve reflexes using osteopathic adjustments, along with a specialized diet and improved elimination. 4. Although slow-acting in its healing effect, requiring 3 to 7 years to cure, a new therapy for multiple sclerosis will emerge, one that stimulates the body's ability to absorb the trace mineral gold, plus the use of therapeutic massage along the spine and the extremities. 5. Many who suffer from epilepsy will be significantly helped by a new form of treatment that recognizes the role played by spinal lesions and a portion of the intestinal tract called the lacteal duct. External castor oil packs on the lower abdomen, along with osteopathic adjustments of particular vertebrae, will be key elements of this new therapy. 6. A diet made up of 80% alkaline-producing foods, most fruits and vegetables, and 20% acid-producing, most meats, grains, and starches, will be identified as the nutritional balance most likely to sustain health. These are just a few of the revolutionary methods Case proposes for 21st century energy medicine. If even a few of them result in positive findings by medical researchers, they may prove to be among his most important Millennium prophecies. Intuition and psychic ability in the Millennium. Another quality of the new root race, as envisioned by Case, is psychic sensitivity. In the minds of many people, extrasensory perception and the new Millennium seem to go hand in hand. This is probably because physically gifted individuals have been widely publicized for their descriptions of what may come in the year 2001 and beyond. However, this linkage is not necessarily the proper one. Just because psychics claim to see the future does not mean that most people who live in that future will be psychic themselves. However, Case's Millennium prophecy about ESP becoming commonplace makes sense as a natural outgrowth of something else he predicted, attunement. If we imagine a world in which most people are consciously making efforts to align the body and the mind with the spirit, then we have a society ripe for psychic development. As Case put it, psychic experience is of the soul. It is an expression of the spiritual forces manifesting in the material world. When people meditate regularly, watch their dreams carefully, and sincerely try to be of service to each other, then the stage is perfectly set for the flowering of clairvoyance, telepathy, and precognition. However, with the blossoming of these latent abilities come challenges and potential difficulties. One needs only to read the biographies of many modern-day psychics to notice that the development of psychic perception usually creates problems. The predicament in which they found themselves was not due exclusively to the skeptical society in which they lived. These gifted psychics had to wrestle with tough questions that came with being telepathic, clairvoyant, or precognitive. For what purpose should such abilities be used? How should intuitive, non-rational sources of information be combined with logical common sense? If coming generations are to be more physically tuned in, we might expect that these kinds of questions will be as frequent in 100 years as are questions today about inflation or global warming. Case's fundamental explanation of how psychic perception works is extremely insightful. It places ESP in a balanced, helpful context. The first principle, as already stated in the phrase, psychic is of the soul, is that psychic experience can be fully understood only in the framework of a physical, mental, and spiritual human nature. Add to this is a significant second premise. Psychic awareness is a normal and natural response of the mind to the desire to be of service to others. One Case reading referred to this orientation as the love intent, acting as a catalyst upon the unconscious mind. That intention to serve and love opens awareness to the ever-present connection between all souls. Both of these fundamental principles are rather metaphysical in nature. They depend upon our willingness to think in terms of non-material reality. However, at the same time, Case suggested that ESP should be a practical, down-to-earth tool for daily living. It is of little value unless we can find ways to use it productively in materiality. For example, healing baffling diseases, as demonstrated in Case's own work, or making insightful leadership decisions that benefit many people. But whatever form it takes, psychic sensitivity needs to be applicable in a three-dimensional physical sense. This brings us to a distinct challenge for how we will respond to awakening psychic abilities within ourselves. What do we do with impressions we receive about others, impressions that we suspect may be accurate extrasensory information? What is the next step if we are praying for someone and unexpectedly get a strong feeling for what that person should do? It is rather disconcerting to imagine that in the new millennium, we will have everyone walking around giving unsolicited psychic readings for each other. We must have a balanced way of sharing this information without seeming pushy or invading the privacy of others. If, in fact, psychic experience is to become commonplace in the decades and centuries to come, then it is crucial that we find acceptable approaches for sharing intuitive impressions. A part of the answer may lie in a willingness to communicate impressions without forcing the issue. As Case put it, in other words, we can relate our inner experiences while simultaneously admitting that they might not be telepathic or clairvoyant at all. A dream or meditation experience can be told in such a way that the listener can comfortably refuse to see it as a psychic impression about him or her. For example, suppose you have a dream in which your next-door neighbor is trying to put out a smoldering fire in his bedroom. You suspect this may be a telepathic dream about his emotional conflicts related to his marriage, because several years earlier, during a period when you were having marriage difficulties of your own, you had dreams about trying to put out a bedroom blaze. You now suspect that the dream about your neighbor is telepathic, sensitivity to an unspoken problem. Case would encourage you to share the dream with him, but in a way that makes it easy for him to respond that your dream must surely be only about yourself. However, in telling the dream, the possibility always exists that it may actually be psychic in nature and may be received gratefully by your neighbor, allowing him to open up and talk with a sympathetic friend or to admit that he needs a counselor's help. Related to the same issue is how we treat information that seems to be precognitive in nature. This is tricky, and we can subtly mislead ourselves if we're not careful. What do you do with impressions that appear to be guidance? Sometimes that information comes in response to prayers asking for direction and a decision. Other times it may come without your particularly seeking it. In either case, a delicate balance is needed between obedience to the inner reality and plain common sense. God wants you to use your logical, intellectual mind, but not exclusively that level of mind. To do so is to become rigid and uninspired. On the other hand, soul growth does not come from blind obedience to every subjective impression that comes into awareness. In a number of readings, Case recommended a specific exercise for developing one's psychic perception and making practical life decisions. We can well imagine that in the 21st century, a technique such as this, one will frequently be employed. Here is a detailed outline of the steps in a decision-making procedure that, by helping you learn how to receive intuition from universal awareness, can stimulate increased psychic development. 1. Set your spiritual ideal. You will find instructions on how to do this in the early portion of Chapter 8. It is a matter of identifying the core value of your life. Case usually encouraged people to pick a word, e.g. peace or Buddha or God, or a short phrase, e.g. joyfully creativity, or oneness with Christ, to capture a sense of this aspiration for one's own growth and development. 2. Pose a question, one that can be answered yes or no, concerning some decision you must make. In working on this exercise, you may choose a simple question or problem that you are currently facing in life, or you may choose one that is profoundly significant to you. Whatever problem you decide to work on, write it out in the form of a yes or no question describing the decision you face. For example, the question, should I go back to college, is much easier to work with than what should I do now that I have a lot of free time. The latter is too open-ended and avoids a consciously made choice. 3. Make a conscious yes or no decision in answer to the question you have just posed. Part of our growth in consciousness as souls involves learning how to make decisions properly, ones that are in accord with the divine will. Practicing the act of making a careful decision is important. In making that preliminary, conscious decision, you will want to take into consideration all the information you consciously have access to. Be sure that this provisional decision is one you would be willing to carry out. 4. Measure the tentative decision by your spiritual ideal. Ask yourself, could I follow through on my decision and still be true to my spiritual ideal? If the answer is yes, you could be true to your ideal. Then go on to step 5. But it is no, go back to step 3 and try the opposite decision. Occasionally a person finds that neither a decision of yes nor one of no will allow him to remain true to his spiritual ideal. In that case, the person is not really ready to make a decision, and he should turn to consistent prayer and a deeper analysis of the question being faced. 5. Meditate, not on the question, but for attunement. With this step, we are beginning a process whereby we seek a confirmation from within ourselves of the provisional decision made in step 3. This confirmation or denial is likely to be accurate only to the degree that we have in meditation attuned ourselves to universal awareness. Do not let yourself be tempted into dwelling on the decision during meditation. Put the question aside and have a period of silent focus upon a statement of your spiritual ideal. 6. At the end of your meditation, ask the question and listen for a yes or no answer from within. The listening sometimes elicits a response from an inner voice. At other times, the answer comes as a hunch or an inner impression. Occasionally, a person will get nothing at all during this period. In that case, he'll want to extend the listening period and pay special attention to his dreams. If this is done, a precognitive dream frequently follows, saying, in effect, if you follow through on the decision you've made, here are the likely results. One can then consciously judge whether or not the likely consequences are acceptable. If they are not, a change in the decision is called for. 7. Measure the guided decision by your spiritual ideal. After receiving a confirmation or denial, either at the end of the meditation or by way of a dream, one should once check again to make sure that the latest understanding of the proper choice does not violate the nature of one's own spiritual ideal. 8. Act on the guided decision. No form of psychic or intuitive development has much meaning unless we act upon whether we receive. Be sure to do this in relation to the specific situation on which you have been working with the previous 7 steps. After going through this exercise, you may want to repeat each of the steps, especially if the decision you face is an important one. At the end of the procedure, you might wish to record your question, decision, and resulting action, as well as your feelings about this exercise. All of this is exactly the process Case envisioned for how he would be making important personal decisions in the new millennium. A new consciousness about the law of supply. We've already seen that in the World Affairs reading. Case made a number of prophetic statements about the destiny of the nation, including some economic prophecies. Chief among them was the likelihood of an armed revolution unless humanity found a way to level the playing field. In regard to all the physical necessities of life, his Millennium prophecies also addressed the question of personal finances. That is, Case envisioned a way that people would one day live in a relationship to a universal law of supply, or as he called it, the law of abundance. Many people are convinced primarily because of financial pressures that these really are times of change. The challenge comes as a test to make do with less. Unfortunately, others who could potentially get by with a more modest way of living won't do it. Instead, their frequent response is to go deeper in debt, borrowing against the future. But when a person is borrowed against the future, oftentimes tomorrow looks more and more like something to be avoided. Hope, expectancy, and optimism fade because the future toward which they are headed is even more debt-ridden. However, we personally experience these times of change in regard to finances. The opportunity of the millennium shift is to rediscover that God is the source of all supply, and that by our own consciousness we create the degree of our access to it. In personal advice given to many individuals who came to the Case because of economic woes, he said that financial challenge at hand was an opportunity to understand this link between God, one's own consciousness, and material resources. Ideally, we would live in a world guided by the principle that God is the source of all physical supply. It would be a world whose people were fed, sheltered, and cared for medically. The personal and physical needs of every individual would be secure. Such a condition is part of Case's vision for our future, but we still have considerable work to do in achieving such a consciousness. Until the day comes when all humanity is prepared to adopt this type of awareness, we can only work as individuals to manifest the law. To understand Case's vision of the law of supply and how economic healing works, we must begin with the definition of supply. Think of it as physical resources for living, which include food, shelter, money, or anything else of the material world we need. The Bible, the Edgar Case readings, and so many other teachings all instruct us that God is the source of all supply. In other words, the physical plane of existence is a creation of the infinite and is sustained by it. The energy that is in food is a projection into matter of God's creative forces. The mineral kingdom, be it oil, gold, or whatever, it is a manifestation of divine energies of a higher dimension. Even money itself, which symbolizes a kind of earthly power or influence, is only a lesser dimensional projection of God's power. This idea of power is reminiscent of Jesus' statement to Pilate, that he had no power except that which God had allowed him to have. Note that we have said God is the source of supply, not God is the distributor of supply. It is a subtle but highly significant distinction. Many people hear the words of the first phrase, but understand them as those in the second phrase. This kind of thinking supposes God to be the dispenser of material goods and money. It suggests that if you are on good terms with God, then He will put material rewards in the pipeline for you, and you do not need to have an anthropomorphic notion of God to think in this fashion. Even if you have a more abstract idea of God, such as universal mind, or creative forces, or cosmic love, this sort of outlook can still control your thinking. But this is not what is meant by God as the source of supply. God is supply. The energies and consciousness of the divine are infinite, yet they manifest in three-dimensional physical world. Those manifestations are everything we think of as the resources for material living. It is in this sense that God is the source of all supply, but we do not have to coerce Him into a willingness to give us our share. God is not the boss at work who must be convinced that we deserve a raise. Instead, it is by our own consciousness that we create our access to supply. We are the dispensers and distributors of the infinite energies as they manifest in materiality. By the patterns of our thinking, feeling, and acting, we determine as individuals the amount of physical resources to which we have access and responsibility. That means money, food, energy, shelter, clothing, free time, and much more. Contrary to what many still believe, there is not a limited supply which can accommodate only a select few. Certainly there may appear to be a current shortage in some specific forms of supply, but the resources of physical living are obtainable for every person of planet Earth if our consciousness is properly attuned as individuals and collectively. However, sometimes our experience seems to contradict this fundamental principle. Sometimes it doesn't seem that by our consciousness we create our access to supply. We all know of people who seem to have a highly attuned, loving spirit, and yet they still experience material shortages. Some of us may be good examples of this ourselves. To understand what is going on, we may have to look more deeply than the conscious patterns of thinking. The matter of economic healing and supply is the concern of the soul, and necessarily involves unconscious levels of the mind, especially memory patterns from the present lifetime and past lifetimes. Simply put, we often must be patient in achieving economic healing, just as we would with physical healing. We might prefer a quick metaphysical trick to make us rich. We might be tempted by simplistic positive thinking that promises instant riches. In the same way, we might like a pill to take care of illness instead of having to make deep changes of body, mind, and spirit. Many souls have chosen to meet in this lifetime certain karmic patterns from the past, which express themselves as the challenges and tests of privation. Certainly, a good first step toward healing these conditions, especially the inner conditions of the soul, is a positive conscious outlook, even the expectation of better times. If material levels of supply do not alter instantaneously, it is not because the spiritual principle is wrong. Instead, it might be that unconscious distortions of mind and emotion change slowly. Keeping in mind this need for patience, let us consider some of the ways in which we create our access to supply. God is the source not just of supply, but abundant supply. By the way in which we understand and respond to this divine characteristic of abundance, we are creating an aspect of our consciousness toward material supply. The Bible beautifully illustrates God's intent to express himself abundantly. The story of the loaves and fishes is an excellent example. Not only did Jesus manifest enough food to feed everyone who was there that day, but there are such an abundance of food that tremendous quantities of leftovers were collected. Yet what does abundance have to do with painful shortages that we may now be experiencing? By a twist of irony, the spiritual law is that our access to supply today is at the least in part created by what we have done with the abundant conditions in the past. In other words, we may be facing difficult challenges of material shortages to help us grow and change our previous tendencies to misuse abundance. Observe two circumstances in which we have a problem with supply. One is when there is not enough and we experience discomfort, pain, or frustration. Of course, when there is just exactly enough, when supply perfectly matches need, then none of these problems exist and everything is fine. But a second challenging circumstance exists when there is more than enough. It is an often overlooked difficulty which is created when the amount available exceeds the need. What do we do with what is left over? How do we deal with such abundant conditions? The degree to which we deal responsibly and lovingly with the extra amount may clearly depict our real ideal toward material supply. To understand how this process may have been working in your life, consider some of the categories of supply and some questions about how abundance might affect each one of them. Some of the most important categories are not ones we immediately think of when we consider material resources, but which are still significant aspects of physical life and the gifts granted by God to a soul in its incarnation. 1. Money. What do you do when you have a little extra money? How is it used? What desires is it used to fulfill? 2. Free time. What do you do with your extra time in the day? Do you waste it or use it creatively? 3. Energy. How responsible are you with energy when you're not paying the utility bill? For example, when you stay in a hotel where you seem to have all the heat, lighting, and hot water you want at no extra expense, how conservation-minded are you? 4. Food. How careful and responsible are you in taking only the food you generally need, or will even be able to eat, when you visit an all-you-can-eat restaurant? 5. Talent and skill. What do you do when the job you have to perform requires of you less talent or skill than you already have? Do you do just the minimum acceptable standard, or do you fully use the abundance you have and produce a better than expected result? The answers to these and similar questions will help you get a sense of how you deal with abundance. It may give you a clue as to what kind of consciousness and access to supply you are creating for the future. In observing this process, you should realize that effects can be produced across categories. In other words, misuse of abundance in one area of life can create the need for lessons of shortage in another category. Fortunately, the principle also works in a more positive way too. Responsible use of abundance in one area of life can produce proper supply in another area. Case envisioned that the last 4 decades of the 20th century would be a time of testing to prepare us for the challenges of living in a new millennium. Many of those tests have to do directly with material resources and the law of supply. Collectively, the American people seem to be experiencing the working of this law as a nation. Americans were blessed with an abundance of natural resources and yet have not been ecologically responsible in stewardship. Current problems such as pollution are in turn creating difficulties in maintaining the previous levels of energy, clean water, and safe air. The same process can be at work for an individual soul. The waste or misuse of resources may have developed in this lifetime or a past one. In either case, it is a pattern of behavior that runs counter to the evolutionary flow of the soul, and it is the soul itself that chooses and creates shortages to stimulate the learning process. That learning can be straightforward and efficient if the individual chooses to try a new attitudinal and behavioral approach, or it can be protracted and painful if the shortage is blamed on others and violently resisted. This is not meant to be a call for passivity in the face of poverty. There are social injustices in our world that foster poverty, but for any individual soul, the work to change such conditions of shortage must begin with the personal responsibility and motivation. It can be done and has been done by specific individuals, and largely by the courageous effort and example will the acute material shortages of a great segments of humankind be transformed in the millennium. It will not come overnight in the year 2001, nor will it arrive magically, but Case's vision of the future were hopeful and state that we will someday understand and live purposefully with the law of abundance. A conclusion about the Case Millennium Prophecies. Throughout this chapter and the previous one, we've examined Case's visionary statements about the future. Some sound rather frightening, while others quickly inspire hope and enthusiasm for the future. But how are we to understand these predictions about earth changes, geopolitical shifts, and an emerging new lifestyle? How do we cope with the measure of uncertainty and anxiety they are likely to instill in almost anyone who hears these prophecies? The best answer probably lies in a careful look at the one central theme of the prophecies. The very essence of Case's prophecies was not earthquakes or tidal waves or volcanic eruptions, not cities destroyed or the changing coastlines of the earth's continents, nor is the essence of his prophecies a change in the balance of power, a new way of doing medicine, or a new relationship to the law of abundance. Instead, the heart of the Case Millennium Prophecies is a new world about to be born. It is a world that is so different than what has been experienced for a long time on this planet that some kind of transitional experience is required. The old patterns of living, the old ways of thinking, are so contrary to what the new must be that a big step for humanity is just ahead. There needs to be some rite of passage. However, there are various ways to get from where we have been to where we need to be. All that a psychic or prophet can do is to read the momentum of the present day. In effect, all that Case could do was to describe the trends and identify the likeliest among the possible pathways humanity could choose. And in 1932, 1936, and 1941, Case kept seeing the same scenario. The momentum of our choices seemed to be taking us on a pathway leading to tremendous earth changes and painful socioeconomic alteration. Have we stayed on that course since Case stopped giving readings? We can only look at our world and guess. The signs do not look very promising. Humanity continues to pollute the earth and start destructive wars. Surely these are kinds of activities that alienate us from the earth, from the mother aspect of God. A symbolic way of viewing earth changes, if they literally do happen, is that the earth will shake us to our senses. We will be forced into a new humility and respect for the forces of nature. We will have to re-examine what we have been doing to the earth, and by consequence, what we have been doing to each other. However, all that is only one pathway. Remember the vision. Remember what the prophecy really is: a spiritual rebirth on this planet, a global family, an era of peace and cooperation. And there are many paths to get there. Some of those ways are more catastrophic than earth changes would ever be, such as nuclear war. Others are more grateful, that is, full of God's grace. Not that they would be there without their pain, because certain things must be surrendered, and there's always discomfort and pain in letting go of old possessions and self-images. The choice is still with us to select a transitional scenario full of grace. Our primary concern about times and changes should be to find such a pathway. We should not be as concerned about whether people believe the Case prophecies of earth changes as we are with how people can begin to live with a new millennium consciousness. If sufficient numbers of us will live now the vision of what the world and humanity are to become, then it is quite likely that our collective rite of passage can be survived by most of all humanity. Many of the remaining chapters in this book concern such a hopeful point of view. There is no better place to start looking for a hopeful view of what's ahead than the category of Case's Millennium Predictions. We have not yet considered prophecies of Christ's return. That is the focus of the next chapter.